Hello, good evening. Welcome to the David Ellis Report. Tonight we are talking integrated defence review. According to the UK government paperwork on the review, the integrated review of security, defence and development and foreign policy, the integrated review will define the government's vision for the UK and the role of the government over the next decade. It will re-examine the UK's priorities, objectives in light of the UK's departure from the European Union, and at a time when global landscaping is changing rapidly, including as a result of COVID-19. The Prime Minister, Alexander, Al to his friends, aka Boris, or is that Sasha, announced the integrated review in February 2020. The review reports to him and the National Security Council, now headed by Chief Brexit negotiator David Frost. The review will be supported by a team across Whitehall, the Cabinet Office and a small team in number 10. Boris paused the review in April in order to focus on dealing with COVID. It was formally restarted in June. The integrated review has been getting some press coverage, including suggestion that Britain's heavy armour will be scrapped. This was denied by Secretary of State for Defence Ben Wallace, and in the Mail, which claimed that Dominic Cummings was sending a message to the generals. The Mail article included photos, well placed for the photographers, of a letter from retired Air Force General Bernard Shraver, written in 1986 to the head of President Ronald Reagan's Blue Ribbon Commission on Defence Management, which examined allegations of procurement overspending. Cummings clearly staged this photo opportunity, and the question is, why? I suspect it was related to this.
Can't deter if lots of your equipment is old, tired, rusty and obsolescent because the procurement programs to replace them are way over budget and years late. My final word on the subject is this. 13 reviews, decades of failure, 1986, Michael Heseltine and Peter Levine produced a report called Learning from Experience after the Nimrod debacle that cost us £1 billion of taxpayers' money, and we had to buy AWACS instead. That was 1986. Could we just make a plea to you? You are the professional head of the armed forces. Please nip back to the department and ask them to sort their bloody selves out, because if not, Cummings is going to come down there and sort you out his own way, and you won't like it.
But there's another potential message here. Bernard Shraver led the US Air Force space and ballistic missile programs, as well as the Strategic Defence Initiative. The assumption some have made is that once again, Cummings is attempting to impose his technology-led vision of AI for the future and other policy areas at this time in defence. But the fact is, this direction of travel has been there for several years. A couple of days ago, Ben Wallace, Secretary of State for Defence, gave a speech on the deck of HMS Tamar on the future of the British Armed Forces. Have a listen.
So let's begin by acknowledging the obvious. The global picture has changed. Our enemies have studied our vulnerabilities and adapted far more quickly than us. The static concept of war versus peace no longer applies, as we are contested on either side of the threshold of armed conflict on a regular basis. Our values and interests are being challenged in the grey zone all over the world.
Systematically exploiting instead that hybrid space that exists between those two increasingly redundant states of peace and war, artificial and binary characterizations of a strategic context that no longer exists today, but which still drives much of our policy and legal definition and their associated frameworks.
So a couple of things might have occurred to you listening to that, because the language that Secretary of State Ben Wallace there is using is the same language that Permanent Secretary Stephen Lovegrove has used, Mark Carlton Smith and Nick Carter. It's common. So did Ben Wallace write that speech? Did Ben Wallace write the policy? Is that Conservative Party policy? These are the questions we need to ask, because it doesn't seem to make any difference as to what any MP is saying, or backbench MP, or complaining about defence cuts, that this policy, which seems to be embedded, is carrying on regardless of any democratic interface. Or whoever the Secretary of State for Defence is. Secondly, the policy he has expressed existed well before Dominic Cummings entered Number 10. The technology advances that Russia and China have expedited and produced with hypersonic missiles are really the key to what's happening here. These missiles render Western navies and Western military tactics obsolete. There isn't currently any defence against it. So if the American Navy or the British Navy wanted to go to sea in anger against any of these navies, they would come into trouble rapidly. The biggest problem we've got is that there isn't a cost-effective defence against it yet. Prototypes are being made, railguns, linear accelerators. But the problem we've got is that to protect large ships like aircraft carriers currently is massive cost. And the cost for China and Russia to produce these hypersonic missiles is small in comparison to the cost of those aircraft carriers. So they have the military advantage currently. So this rendering of modern Western military tactics obsolete and the strategy thereof is seeing really where we're playing out this new role for modern all-means hybrid warfare, because that's the only option available to Western military. Well, there is another option, and that's to use nuclear weapons. So in order to play out modern all-means hybrid warfare, the strategy requires that you cite the enemy as using it, because if you're using it, you have to accuse the enemy of using it. So are they using it? There could be opportunities for both Russia and China to do this now, because the West, with their shortfall in investing in technology, is that giving away technology that already existed with Skybolt? This modern all-means hybrid warfare is going to be playing out until there's a cost-effective way of dealing with the hypersonic missiles. And this is where we've got this grey zone that Nick Carter and Mark Carlton-Smith are talking about, where there's no separation between war and peace. But Stephen Lovegrove has made it clear that in order to pay for perpetual hybrid warfare, the money for new technology has to be found from within the existing defence budget, i.e. that there isn't a will within policy to increase defence budgets to retain conventional weaponry and the current levels of personnel and pay for the new technology. It's looking for that money to come within the existing defence budget. And don't forget that we've already got this problem, that the government is already drawing down on defence to pay for pensions, a double whammy. So we're going to see potentially more reduction in capability. Lovegrove has expressed there is an attitude, as we've seen before within this arena, of new technology. This happened with the Sandys Review in 1957, where we were promised doing jets on a pan-EU basis would be quicker and cheaper. That was the main sales gambit, that we would no longer produce aircraft on a national basis, that we would produce them on a pan-EU basis because it was cheaper. Decades on, we see the consequences of that we've lost the industrial capability to produce a jet on our own, or any aircraft for that matter, and that the gambit that it would be cheaper does not stand up to scrutiny, I don't believe, and that's my personal opinion. Skybolt was axed in order to procure Polaris. There wasn't the will at the time to have both the nuclear deterrent and Skybolt. This is the gap in the market that Russia and China has exploited. They've come in and found that there is a way to produce these missiles cheaply, and they're incredibly effective. And this has produced absolutely turmoil within the Western militaries. Returning to Ben Wallace's speech for the future vision of what is defence for the UK, he had this to say.
Our future force will continue to project our global military power and influence in concert with our other allies. Ours will be an armed force that operates at full capacity with a more flexible force structure that is better equipped for lighter tasks.
If you were listening closely, you would have noticed three main points there. He talked about full capacity. In other words, no resilience. Also better equipped for lighter tasks. So where does that leave such things as heavy armour and tanks in lighter tasks? But the first thing he said was in concert with our EU allies. So that can only mean EU defence. 2 weeks ago, British Parachute Regiment took part in an EU4 exercise in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a rapid response integration exercise. Integrating with what, you may ask? What was the legal framework that these exercises were being conducted under? And who was in command and control? How does this fit in with Brexit? The Integrated Defence Review is supposed to re-examine UK defence in the light of leaving the EU, and yet the Austrian commander of this exercise made it clear he selected the UK to take part.
Dear citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'm the commander of EUFOR, the integrated military operation of the European Union in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Every year during exercise Quick Response, we test our contingency plans and the capabilities of designated high readiness forces outside the country to fulfill our mandate. This rehearsal also reaffirms and strengthens the close cooperation we have with local authorities, with law enforcement agencies and with the armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This summer we have selected forces from Austria, Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Romania, the United Kingdom and KFOR to join the troops in theatre. 20 nations united under EUFOR command.
20 nations united under EU4 command. No defence union with Britain in it? At least the EU are being open and honest about defence union. Here in the UK, all concerned remain totally silent on this issue. Here's Mark Carlton-Smith again.
And I think as a military community, by which I mean all of us, those in uniform, the civilians, our defence correspondents and opinion formers.
If the British Army considers defence correspondents and opinion formers to be colleagues and part of the military even, how can there be anything other than silence on this tricky issue? So let's take a closer look at what's occurred during this recent training exercise with EU4.
težištom usmjerena na obuku da u vježbi osim oružanih snaga Bosne i Hercegovine učestvuju i drugi bezbjednosni elementi Bosne i Hercegovine. On dodatno jačava ne samo saradnju sa EUFOR-om, već i saradnju između sigurnosnih struktura Bosne i Hercegovine.
Godišnja vježba za sve nas će biti prilika da tu saradnju potvrdimo i ojačamo, da javnosti pokažemo spremnost EUFOR-ovih rezervnih snaga da zajedno sa bosansko-hercegovačkim oružanim i policijskim snagama brzo i efikasno odgovore na krizne situacije koje ugrozu stabilnost Bosne.
I'm pleased to inform you that after months of intensive planning, under the able guidance and leadership of the Chief of Staff of EUFOR, Brigadier General Erno Barat, who also acts as the Exercise Director, we are now ready to launch Exercise Quick Response 2020.
Did you see the paratroopers were wearing EU masks? Did you also see that there were 10 British armoured personnel carriers there? Who's paying for this? Does it come out of the MOD budget? And will that be considered part of the Integrated Defence Review? Returning to Ben Wallace for a moment to sum up, here is the vision for the future.
It will be a future force that not only maintains our leadership in NATO, but is more forward deployed, deterring Russian activity in Europe.
Did you hear him mention the Sahel? Listen to Ursula von der Leyen's position on the Sahel.
First of all, our collective defense, we are ironclad committed to NATO. NATO of 29, that is collective defense Article 5. But there are problems and issues where I do not see NATO, but Europe has to be able to act. I was talking about Africa. This is not a typical place for NATO. We are very committed to NATO in other places, but Africa is a place where we need to be able to act as Europeans. And for that, we created the European Defence Union.
That could not be clearer. UK involvement in the Sahel can only mean EU command and control. So is the Integrated Defence Review about creating an independent British capability fit for the 21st century? Or is it in fact a coordinated review in order to slot into European defence structures, avoiding duplication? Good night.